Hello, everybody. This is your instructor, Andre, and today's training is about how data works. Now, this training specifically targets all of my Excel users because, as it turns out, most programs that work with data will have all of the structures in place to make sure that your data is stored properly and that no rules are being broken. But the one program that doesn't have these things in place that lets you destroy your data on a daily basis is Excel. So today I'm going to talk about what those data rules are and how, for you, my Excel users, you can watch with your Excel data to make sure that you don't break any of these rules. What you'll find is by following all of these rules, you will find that Excel will start to unleash the magic when you're working with that program, because Excel will finally say to you, finally, I understand what you're talking about. Finally, I understand what your data looks like. So let's simplify what are the rules of data. Now, first, I want to start by saying that data has four aspects to it that you have to manage. All right. So the first aspect that you have to manage is you have to manage collecting data. Now, when you collect data, there's going to be a certain set of rules and also tools and best practices that you're going to have to manage, right? But after you collect the data, it moves to the second aspect of data, which is storing the data. And just the same, there are rules and tools and best practices when it comes to storing the data. Then from there, it moves on to analyzing the data, rules, tools, best practices, and then finally presenting the data. Now, the data flow, as I like to call it, will happen in this order every time. You'll always collect the data and then store it, analyze the data, and then present it. Now, let's talk about what tools you would use to do this. So the primary tool that you're going to use to collect data is always going to be the form. So you're going to collect data in the data form. Then the primary tool that you use to store data is the data table. Now, I'm going to distinguish here. When I say store data in a data table, that is different than what sometimes looks like a data table, which is where you're doing all of your analysis. Now, your analysis is actually being done in a data query, but sometimes a query and a table will look very much alike, in the sense that they both have rows and columns, right? But I will help you distinguish between stored data in a data table and query data, which also looks as if it's in a data table. All right. Then the final tool that you would use is the data report. Now, the report can be a physical report, or it could be the act of you reporting. Like, for example, I'm going to report to my boss, or I'm reporting this information out to my audience. All right. So those are the four aspects of data. Now, I want to clarify that if you're working in any tool or system that you have in place that can collect, store, analyze, and present data, you are working in a database. That is a characteristic of every known database. I also want you to know that when it comes to Excel, people will often call Excel a database, or they'll call it a flat database. But just to simplify the idea, realize that Excel is not really a database. What Excel is created to do is not all four of these data elements. It's only really created to do two out of four of these data elements, and that is to store and analyze data. Now, I get that Excel makes a great looking chart, but there are really very, very few tools that are in Excel that are designed to present data or collect data. Of course, if you're collecting data, you're going to be using something like maybe Adobe Acrobat to create forms, or you're going to be using some of the new form apps that are out there, Microsoft Forms, SurveyMonkey. You're collecting with those tools instead. And then, yes, you could store data in Excel. You could analyze the data definitely in Excel. But then when it comes to reporting, we're talking about showing the data. So we're using things like PowerPoint, or we're using Power BI, or we're using other data type tools that are designed to present. So Excel doesn't really compete with those tools. So when it comes to Excel, Excel is really only created to store data and analyze it. So you want to be careful that you're not trying to use Excel for more than what it's really created for, because then that's when you start to get headache. You ever notice trying to print something in Excel? Yeah, it's always a headache because Excel's not actually created to report. So now, when I ask my students, I usually ask my students, of these four elements, which element do you think is the most significant element? Which is the most critical element? Now, I'm going to go over what many of my students say because I want you to see what you relate to. So most of my students, the number one answer is collect is the most important. And I usually hear things like garbage in, garbage out, and you can't do any of the others if you don't collect the data, all of which are true statements, right? But then somebody will come in and say, yeah, but I really think store is the most important because if you collect the data, sure, you could do all these things, but where's the data after you analyze it? In other words, are you just using the data as a one-time use? No, you probably want to collect the data and store it somewhere. Also, you're going to have to prepare the data and organize it properly. So just because you collected the data doesn't necessarily mean it's organized. So those are my arguments for why store is the most important. If you don't store and analyze the data, you're not going to really be able to, if you don't store the data and organize the data properly, you don't really have a good spot to start from when you want to do your analysis and present. So those are my arguments that I usually get for store. Now, a few of you will then say analyze. And this starts to become fewer of you that actually say analyze. And most of my students will say analyze because they say, well, it's one thing to collect and store the data, but stored data doesn't actually have any value. Like just having a pot of data doesn't really help you. You really have to go through the data and extract what is important about the data and giving the data meaning. So those are what my people say for analyze, but the actual answer is present. Present is actually the most crucial aspect of working with data. And the reason I say this, I don't mean that you just have a pretty report. That's not what I mean there, right? But I want you to understand that present is the entire reason that the database exists. Now, let me clarify this. I'm going to give you some analogies that you'll relate to, and then you'll recognize why I say present is the most crucial piece. All right. So if you, let's say that instead of collecting data, let's say that we're collecting food. All right. So you're going to collect the food and at the grocery store, and then you're going to bring it home and you're going to store it in your refrigerator table. All right. And then you're going to then look in your refrigerator table and decide what are we going to make for dinner. And you're going to analyze that food in your oven on your stovetop. You're going to cook dinner, and then you are going to present dinner on the dinner table. And what's the most important part of that process? Definitely having dinner. Now, here's another example. You're going to collect some clothes at Nordstrom's rack, right? Then you're going to bring it home. You're going to store all your clothes in the closet. Then you're finally going to get up in the morning. You're going to analyze your outfit, and you're going to choose an outfit, analyze yourself in the mirror, and then you're going to present yourself to work, thankfully, with clothes on. What is the most important part of that process? Definitely showing up to work with clothes on, okay? So I want you to know that present is what actually drives the other three. And if there's no reason to show up to work with clothes on, then there's no reason to get up and analyze yourself in the mirror, and there's no reason to actually go into your closet and store, and there's no reason to go shopping for work clothes if you are not going to go to work, right? So I want you to know that present is what drives it. Now, a lot of times, this is where I get a lot of resistance. So I'm just going to continue to drill this part home, that present is what structures the whole database, and it's what drives it. Now, I'm going to give you some other examples. Let's say you're filling out a job application, right? Now, when you're filling out your job application, they're collecting all the information from you, and you're going to put all your information in there, including education. You're going to put your elementary school, your high school, all that stuff in under education. You're going to put all of your job history. All right. Then they're going to store your job application until the deadline. And then after they store it, they're going to then analyze all those job applications and they're going to narrow it down to the top 3 people. And you're one of them. And so now you're now called to come in and present for your interview. What's the most important part of the job process? Definitely the interview. All right. So it all is always driven from the present. Now, there's some misconceptions that are also floating around about this. And the number one misconception is show your work. So what happens is, because you think collect is the most important, or store is the most important, you collect all of your data and then you store it, and then you take all of that stored data and you dump it into a giant report, because the idea is if I have the data, I have to show all the data. So you then dump all this data into a report, you kind of bypass the analysis a little bit, and you go straight to present, and now you have a big 80-page report. But here's the problem with that, right? If I were to invite you over to dinner, and I went shopping and collected all the food, I stored all the food in my refrigerator, and then I analyzed and made your dinner and your meal, and then I presented your meal on the table, would you also enjoy me going back and taking all the food from my refrigerator and also fitting it on the table for you as well, so I could show all of my work? Here's all the food that I have when I serve you dinner. Is that really how that works? Or should I do this? Should I have you eat dinner, and then after dinner, I'm going to get you up and let's walk over into the kitchen, and then here's all the dishes. Here's where I analyzed all of my dinner for you. Here's all the dishes that I used. And then now let's come and look into the refrigerator. Here's the refrigerator where all the food is stored. No, we never need or want all of that background information. Show your work is a myth that we're all operating under when we're working with data. We don't want to actually show our work. Nobody is asking to see our work. All right. So we're going to get rid of that myth, and then think about your real life data. Like, do you find in your real data, do you find that you have columns that you never touch when you're doing your analysis, where we have collected data and it's being stored, and you have these columns that are never touched, right? And they just sit in your data, kind of like elementary school. Have you ever had a job application where they asked about your elementary school? Well, it was on the application, but of course nobody is ever going to ask you about your elementary school. So realize that when it comes to why is present the most crucial part, here's why. Present is somebody is asking you a question of this data. If nobody's asking for a question, there is no reason for you to analyze data or even store it or even collect it. It's always driven from the present. So for example, when you're going grocery shopping, are you buying the food because the food is important for our nourishment? It is, right? But is that why you're buying the food? Or are you thinking about the meals that you're going to cook for the next week? What are you going to present for dinner? And that drives your analysis, which drives your store, which drives what you collect. All right. So realize that in actuality, data flows in the opposite direction. It starts from what is it that you have to present. And that present is a question that's being asked against the data. And if you don't have that question, I want you to recognize that everything else about your data is completely irrelevant. Now, you know this because when you get given a giant report and they drop that giant report in there, do you read that report from cover to cover? No, you don't, because most of that data in that report is irrelevant to you. And you flip to the page to find the part in that report that answers your question. Here's another example. Have you been sitting in meetings and you're in the meeting and your eyes are rolled to the back of your head because you're thinking to yourself, why am I in this meeting? This meeting has nothing to do with me. This meeting is irrelevant to my position. Why do I have to sit here through the meeting? That's the state that people are in whenever you deliver information that people are not asking for. By the way, we find being given an answer when we haven't asked the question, we as a human race, we find that mildly offensive. So for example, if I was to say, Yeah, student, I saw that your webcam came on while we're doing this remote meeting, and I really need to just counsel you on what you're wearing right now because when I saw that flash, I just thought even for a remote meeting, what you're wearing is just completely unacceptable. And so let me coach you on how to dress properly for work. Like, if I was to say that to a student, don't you guys feel the cringe factor? Hearing me speak that way to another student, wouldn't you feel the cringe factor, right? And that's because we all understand that to offer advice or criticism or constructive criticism to somebody who's not asking is just a bad idea and we don't like it. So the same is true when we're presenting data. If we're presenting answers to somebody who is not actually asking the question, then basically our presentation is landing on deaf ears. Nobody cares, and on top of that, they're actually a little negative and resistant to you about you trying to tell somebody something. Now, trust me, I know because I'm a recovering smart aleck, so I've lived my life telling people answers to things that they weren't asking me for, and I know the consequences, all right? So first and foremost, I need you to recognize that the data flows from the question. If you don't have the question, you should not present the data, all right? Now, here's an example. If your boss asks you to give you the report on car seat distribution across the counties, and you go into the data and start doing analysis and find out that, hey, in this data is the answer to cancer, here's a cure for cancer, I need to push this forward. Can you substitute the car seat report for your boss with a cure for cancer report? No. Even though curing cancer is so important, you cannot substitute that information over what your boss is asking for because your boss still needs the car seat report, even though you have a report on the cure of cancer. So what do? You then try to get someone, your boss or someone, to become aware of the question, what is the cure for cancer? Once you get somebody asking, what's the cure for cancer? Then you now can pull that report out of your back pocket. And that's when you present the cure for cancer report. Once you get someone to ask, because if nobody's asking, even though it's an amazing thing to discover, it is still irrelevant. All right. Now that I've kind of established the data flow and what drives your data, it's always driven by the question. And the question is, what would you like to present? I'll give you one last example. I just really want to drive this home. Okay, your kids want you to make lasagna for dinner. So now you've got to present lasagna for dinner. So in order to present lasagna, you have to know how to analyze it in the kitchen. So you're looking for a recipe. And you find, yes, I do have a recipe for lasagna. So the ingredients now are calling for you to go into your food storage to find the ingredients, and you realize you don't have all the ingredients. So now you have to go collect the ingredients at the grocery store. And when you're at the grocery store, everything you're buying is being driven by the fact that you have to make lasagna. All right. Now, once you collect all those ingredients, you're going to bring it home in a store, you're going to follow the recipe, and then you are going to present lasagna, and that's how it works. So let's talk about the rules for each of these, and let's break it down a little bit. Let's start with collect. So first of all, when you're collecting data, you're using the tool, the data form to collect, and you should collect your data in the smallest form possible. So the smallest form would be, for example, instead of collecting first name, you would collect, instead of collecting full name, you would collect first name, middle name, and last name, right? Then realize that when you're using a form, everything that you collect on that form is related to the person or the thing that you're collecting that information about. So that means every form actually creates a record of information for that person. So every form equals one record. Now remember what the term record means. We're going to talk about it next. And then also remember that the data that you're collecting should be only the information needed to answer the question. So in other words, if we're trying to make a lasagna, I don't actually need to collect ingredients that are not a part of that lasagna dish. So in the same way, we don't have to ask, for example, we don't have to ask for high school or elementary school on a job application because nobody's ever going to ask us about that in a job interview. So there's no reason to have that data. All of those columns in your data that you never touch are data that have been collected where nobody is asking. And so that data sits there in your way most of the time because nobody's ever asking you to analyze that data, so the data is just in the way. So when we collect data, we only collect the data that is related to a current question we're asking. We don't collect anything else. All right. Okay, now moving on to storing data. Storing data is the one that has the most rules to it. So for example, first of all, you're storing your data in a data table. And the rules for using a data table are that a data table must have one header row, all right? There can be no additional titles adjacent to it. There can be no extra header rows to it. And it can't be missing a header row either. So these are some of the rules of creating the actual data table. Now, every row under the data table must be a record. So that means you can't have any blank rows or blank columns through your data. And at the bottom, you can't have a row that says total row because that is not an actual record. Every row under that header row must be a record. And the data that you are collecting must be labeled, of course. So your label data within the record should be to the left, and then all of the rest of the data that you're going to use for your analysis, which I like to call source data, all the rest of that data should be to the right. All right, so in other words, I'll show you an example of what this looks like. But you want every record to be divided with the label data to the left and the source data to the right. Now, these are all rules to actually create the table, but there's one rule that is even more important than all of that, and that is we never work where we store. When you create a data table of stored data, you don't then go and work in it. Now, most of the other data programs will not let you work in the stored data table, but in Excel, Excel has nothing in place to stop you from doing your work directly in your stored data. So I have to teach around that and get you guys to start working elsewhere. You never work in the stored data. Now, here's the truth of it. The truth of it is you all already knew that. Because, for example, when you store your food in the refrigerator, you never climb into your refrigerator to cook it, right? And your car is stored in the garage, but you don't drive your car in the garage. You store your tools in a toolbox, but you don't build anything in the toolbox. You store your books on the bookshelf, right? But you don't actually read anything in the bookshelf, right? You always read elsewhere. You drive your car elsewhere on the roads. You build things elsewhere in the shop. So you don't ever work where you store. Now, this is a really bad habit in Excel. People put the data in Excel and immediately start working on it. We have to break that bad habit. Now, since this does have the most rules, I want to kind of clarify by giving you kind of a real live example of the proper way to store data. So here's an example of stored data. And let's break down what those rules were again. So first of all, every table must have one header row. Can't have two, can't have zero. And when you have stored data, nothing should be adjacent to the data itself. Nothing should be touching the header row or next to. Nothing should be next to those records or beneath those records, okay? Now, the header row must be filled in. Every single cell of the header row must be filled in because those cells identify each column, and those cells are called field names. And there needs to be a field name in every single cell of the header row to define every column. Now, every column is called a field. And when you're collecting data, you're basically taking each one of these columns and organizing them on the form on a flat piece of paper so that you can collect each record of information. Kelly, for example, will fill in each of these fields on the data form, and then once you collect it from the form, you're going to transfer it to the data storage, which looks like this. Now, once you transfer all that data from the form to the stored table, each form would represent one record, and this is what that looks like. And there are times when you're doing analysis where you need to actually address all the records. So when you do, you're going to pull all the records in, but without the header. The header is usually excluded whenever you're working with all the records. All right. Now, one more thing that I want to clarify is when I say label data to the left, this is the label data for these records. This data identifies what the data is. It's Kelly, it's her employee number, and that is what clarifies what the data is. And then once the data is clarified, then we have the source data, which is where we're going to do all of our analysis from this data here. So that is how you properly store data. And in Excel, you have to guarantee that your source data looks just like this. So moving on, we now talk about the rules for analyzing data. Now, analyzing data actually has the fewest set of rules, which means you are free to do as whatever you need to analyze that data. So analyzing data is in a query, and like I was saying before, sometimes it's hard to recognize when a query is a query and not a stored data table. Well, one indicator is that a query is always a subset of your source data. So if you're working with a table that says April data, well, we know April is not the only month that we're going to have data, so we know we're working with the query. Or if you have a query that's asking you to calculate a bunch of the columns in there using formulas or something like that, then you know you're working with an analysis, so you know you're working in a query. Now, one key rule about the query is you should only pull in the data that is relevant to the question that you're trying to answer. So we don't pull in any other ingredients except the ingredients that go for the lasagna, all right? So those are the rules for analyzing, and then we get to the rules for presenting. Now, the tool for presenting is the report, and when we create a report, just know that it must be beautiful. And one key element for making reports beautiful is to remove black lines. Now, many of you have the habit of putting all of your data within black borders, but I want you to know that black borders reduce the beauty of your report, and it's also distracting to the brain. The brain does not like to see black borders, and it doesn't like to process it. So I always recommend that you use the Excel rule. Look at the columns and the color of the borders in Excel, and never have borders darker than Excel. If Excel doesn't do it, you shouldn't do it either, okay? Now, I know that Excel by default gives you black borders, but you're gonna change that, all right? And remember that when you present, you must be answering a known question. You're not data dumping and just displaying data just because you have it. You must be answering a known question, and when you present, you must deliver the answer within 5 seconds. Now, there's a reason for the 5-second rule. I want you to know that your body is under a slight uptick of tension when you have a question. And your body tenses up, and you furrow your brow, and you tilt your head to one side, and you say, because you have a question, right? This is all a reflection of your body undergoing a slight tension there. But when you receive an answer, your body releases the tension, you get a shot of dopamine right to the pleasure center, and you're like, yes, I just figured that out. I just got my answer, right? So the idea is when you have data, you present the question, deliver the answer in 5 seconds, and then next. That puts people in tension and then release. And then in tension and then release. Tension, release. That's how you present the data. Never have all of your questions consolidated in one big giant report, because that keeps all of your audience under tension for an extremely long amount of time until they finally get all of their answers from the report, and then they only get one shot of dopamine. Most people find that not worth it. They find going through your reports drudgery and unfun and unattractive to go through your data reports, because you're just taking too long to produce the answer for them. Many times people will not look at your reports, and they'll call you into the office and ask you the question, and you know what? You're going to stay in the office, and you're not going to take more than 5 seconds to give your boss the answer. You're going to give the boss the answer in 5 seconds, and you're definitely not going to stand there for much longer than that. So that's the rule for presenting. So by all means, please like and subscribe. Jump into the comments. Let's talk more about it. But I just wanted to share that talk. I give that talk to all of my Excel Level 2 classes, and now making it public for you guys. So I hope you have a great day, and look for more coming up on the channel. My name is Andre Banks. Thank you so much for watching.